Hi, welcome to How to D&D. My name is Fred Wheeler and today I want to talk about Dungeons & Dragons. I would talk about James Bond, but no, we're going to talk about the Dungeon Master preparation we need to do, and that is Lesson 6, Learning to Improvise. What is learning to improvise all about? What am I talking about? What does that actually mean? Well, my overview is I'm going to talk about some improvising methods. I'm going to cover Rory's story cubes and how they can be used. Plot twist cards, if you're aware of them, great. If you aren't, I'll cover it. Random charts, and of course that sort of builds into your software random generators as well. Plot points, no game preparation, and what to improvise, and then there's some miscellaneous recommendations I give at the end of this. With everything that I do, I have some objectives. That is to explain everything, demonstrate as much as I possibly can, and allow you to practice, okay? Not necessarily with just Rory's story cubes, but with whatever I can find. Okay, let's talk about the improvising methods that I want to discuss today specifically. And the ones I'm picking are the ones that I'm familiar with. And the first one is Rory's story cubes. Rory's story cubes have been around a long time. These are basically just dice. Plot twist cards are exactly what they sound like. They are cards that have a twist to them, and they're used to affect the story in some way. The next one is your random charts. You'll be aware of this. You'll have seen them. You'll see them in books. You'll encounter them on the internet. Random charts and generators. And then plot points, or plot, I guess you would say, it's in the Dungeon Master Guide, and it's basically a point or an asset that a player will use in your game. And then finally, in terms of an improvising method, is just doing no preparation. So I want to cover each one, the pros and cons of each technique, and then we'll proceed from there. And I think I want to start off with one that I think is probably one of the strongest assets in the arsenal, and that is the Rory story cubes. So Rory story cubes, what you do is you roll a few of these, and you use them to inspire a story idea as quickly as possible. It's basically a way of triggering your brain if it starts going into paralysis. These are 6-sided dice, and they're covered with different pictures or images to offer ideas. Every single side is different, and in the set there are 9 dice. Okay, and out of those 9 dice, there's no single image that's the same. I would suggest to you, try playing with Rory story cubes with your family and friends first before using the story cubes in a Dungeons & Dragons session. This method requires some practice before you start using it. So when you want to apply it to your game session, maybe a good way of doing this is to actually play the game before you play Dungeons & Dragons as people are coming into the dining room or the lounge or whatever. Or maybe you play this outside of your Dungeons & Dragons session just to get used to the concept. Now, there are some good things about this and some bad things about this. One is there is a limited number of images on the dice. So you might find you come to a point where it doesn't spawn any more ideas. But I find they still are a very good tool and relatively light considering. The next one is plot twist cards. This is one you're probably less likely to be aware of. The plot twist card offer mechanical benefits that are related to Pathfinder, the first version of Pathfinder, the roleplay game. So ignore that. I want you to just ignore that section. But it does include narrative suggestions. Usually there's a key word or words that sort of focuses you in terms of what you're going to do with this card or what you could do with this card, and then it gives you about 4 suggestions. They're usually underneath there. Okay, the plot twist card can be used, you can give them out randomly to your players, and they can change the game's plot, they can change the events, the locations, the monsters, they can change anything they want. This is not easy to do in a campaign or adventure, okay? And it can come apart if you wind up with player input that sort of is too much for you to deal with. You just need to be aware that generally you will have to have a method for dealing with this. And I would suggest to you, when you give out these cards, whether you give them as a reward or you simply give everybody randomly a card at the very beginning of your session, the Dungeon Master does not have to accept the player's plot twist card suggestion. If you don't like it, you don't think you can deal with it, say no. There's nothing bad about doing that. You can say no. All you do is take the card off them and ask them to draw a new card. Okay? Because they've tried to use it, and obviously you have said no to that, so they need to have a new card so that they can try to integrate that at some point during the adventure. Now, whether you allow them to bank these cards or whether they have to use them all up during your game session, that's really completely up to you. There's lots of different ways of doing it. I find that this is very good for getting you started in terms of having to improvise. It forces you to improvise because the players are putting input into there outside of the normal, I'm just going to have my character do something. They're actually trying to affect the story and be kind of like part of the dungeon master themselves. The next one that you're probably very familiar with, and that is random charts. Now, random charts have been around a long time for obvious reasons because they're useful. Random charts can be used to generate anything and everything for a dungeon master. You'll find that most dungeon master guides, even the Pathfinder Game Mastery Guide, has plenty of charts that you can use. And almost every roleplay game has some sort of guide, whether it's a Game Master Guide or a Dungeon Master Guide, that gives you a whole array of different charts. Now, there's also websites that have huge numbers of these. The problem with using random charts and tables in a game and improvising is that you need to be well organized. So you need to take your random tables and you need to be well organized. You either need to have a folder where they all go so you can flip through it very quickly, or you need to have a quick access point online if you're going to use it online. And if it's online, you need to have a folder system that can be accessed, and you can just, a search bar is probably something you're going to need to do this. Now, I'm not going to refer you to any kind of particular software for doing this because I'm not trying to sell their product to you. So that's the thing to consider, is you need to organize your random charts if you're going to use them to improvise in your game. Another point, which is sort of carrying on from the plot twist cards that I talked about before, probably even more difficult than using plot twist cards, but I'm still going to discuss it because it does exist, and that is plot points. Now, plot points are basically like you give either one or two of these to your players. It's discussed in the Dungeon Master Guide for Dungeons & Dragons 5e. It's on page 269 to 270, and allows the player the ability to affect anything. There's no restriction on the theme or what basically they can do. Like plot twist cards, there's kind of a restriction, okay? There's no restriction. They can affect anything in the campaign, anything about the adventure, anything about the plot, anything about non-player characters, monsters, locations, anything in the game whatsoever. So this suffers from the same issues as the plot twist cards. The only difference is it can be quite a lot more significant. In other words, it's much harder to do than the plot twist cards. This is why I'm mentioning the plot twist cards, because I feel like it's a softer entry to that sort of method. Now, if you're not open to that, again, I would go with the same approach. If they use their plot twist, their plot point, and you don't want to change the story in that way because it's too hard for you to manage, just say no and say you can use your plot point at a different time to try and do something else. Okay, that would be my suggestion to you. There are times where you need to say yes and, okay, rather than no, but there are times where you have to say no, but we can do this. Right, the next thing, and probably the most brutal method for learning how to improvise, and this is just doing no game preparation. Usually doing no game preparation to learn how to improvise is forced upon the dungeon master or game master by accident. So doing no game or adventure preparation forces a dungeon master to improvise a roleplay game or a Dungeons and Dragons game because they have nothing to refer to. Not something I recommend at all to a dungeon master who hates feeling stressed or panicked. So I wouldn't necessarily say this is a great idea. If you're the sort of person who can mellow out and doesn't really worry about things, then maybe this is a technique you could use. This method, as I said, is often practiced by a dungeon master or a game master as a result of having no time to plan for their game session. They can't give up the idea of not running the game. because they haven't done any preparation and they needed that preparation. So they decide to run the game and just not worry about it. Now, I have run games like that and found that they have been perfectly fine, and also found that they've been complete garbage. But then again, I've had complete garbage games where I prepared as well, so it doesn't really seem to matter too much. It also depends on the type of person you are. What I will say about doing no game preparation is you'll be surprised at the results. You'll probably find that you are not happy with the results, but your players might well be very happy with the results. So you do need to ask for feedback, and hopefully they can give you honest feedback that isn't cruel. The only problem with doing no game preparation when you're trying to learn to improvise and forcing yourself to do it and forcing yourself to do everything is it's a lot to bear, and you can get some really cruel player feedback. And this is usually a result of players not being dungeon masters, and also not being dungeon masters, but not understanding that what they do in terms of improvising with their character is actually not very good either. And so you have to allow people to actually learn to improvise, and the only way to do that is to practice. You have to practice improvising to get better at it. And if you don't have players willing to allow you to practice and make mistakes as you learn to improvise, then you can't improvise. And frankly, it's a very difficult situation, particularly as players will force dungeon masters to improvise by having their characters do something. So if you have players that operate that way, there's a real big problem here. Now, how you resolve that is really up to you. You're a big person, okay? You have to solve that yourself. I'm not going to give you advice. I don't do how to deal with problem players or how to deal with problem dungeon masters videos. And anytime you see them, they will always be in jest and poking fun at that sort of thing. Okay, what to improvise in your game? Okay, so you can use your Rory story cubes, you can use your plot twist cards, you can use your random charts, you can use no game preparation. Maybe you listen to music. I mean, who knows how it is, but what sort of things can you add that into your game? Whether it be a Dungeons & Dragons game or a roleplay game, I'm going to suggest the following things tend to come up quite a lot. The title of a book found on a bookshelf or on a desk. It's something that players always seem to ask us. If you say there are books or bookshelves, they want to know what the name of the titles of the books are so that they can grab them. Okay, so improvising those is going to happen. The contents of a book when they want to read the book. This is for players who are really trying to force the issue. Okay, but it does come up. It's happened to me. The creation of a non-player character, quite common. We suddenly need to have information on a NPC or non-player character. You don't have this information, so you can develop your personality traits, your ideals, your bonds, your flaws, and your motivation simply by rolling dice, and you use the images to represent each aspect of the NPC. Now, this method was described, and there's a video on it that Sly Flourish put out, or Mike Shea, and I suggest checking it out. You can create quick adventure hooks for side quests if you need to, just by using these techniques. Random encounters. Now, I'm not talking about combat encounters. That's easy. You just flip through a monster manual and you find a monster that seems appropriate. Fair enough. No, when I mean random encounters, I mean things that aren't related to combat. Everything else other than that. A letter. The contents of a letter from a PC that presents a clue to complete an adventure goal of some kind. So often if you have a letter or a diary, then you'll want to know what's actually in there, and those story cubes or plot twist cards or your charts might be quite useful. Runes found in an ancient temple or a castle or a tomb that unlock a magical secret. Just using them to decide what monsters you're going to use or incorporate into your campaign or your adventure. Developing travel locations for your party to see as they journey through from one place to another. Creating, say, an official document, whether it be a birth certificate, a land deed, or something like this. Journal entries, I kind of mentioned that in terms of the letters. Loot items, trinkets that they could come across, and magic items. And that's not the end of the list, but I'm not going to give you any more because that's enough to start with. Now, with everything that I do on this channel, I always try to give you some miscellaneous recommendations. So my miscellaneous recommendations to you is, please don't judge your own improvising strictly. It's not fair. It's not fair to you. It's not fair to the process. Okay, it's not clear what your players will enjoy, even if you don't think it's very good. I've often found when I improvise that something that I've done that I thought was terrible, my players loved, which is kind of really frustrating when you spent a lot of time preparing only to find that you didn't actually need to do that. It doesn't always work that way, but I have found that can be the case. Improvising takes time to practice, and you need to practice before the game and during the game to get better at doing it. So expect not to be very good at it, okay? Because you will need time to do this. And if you do not have players willing to allow you to practice to improvise and get better at it and do things that won't work, you've got a real problem here. You won't be able to grow. And I can assure you a group like that will probably fracture at some point. Even if your players don't like a dungeon master improvising a game, that doesn't mean that a player's feedback needs to have a lot of weight, okay? So even if the players want you to improvise or don't want to improvise, you've got to remember you need to take players' feedback with a grain of salt, particularly if they've never been a dungeon master. If they've never been a dungeon master, their feedback is not actually that as important. Now, why is this? It's because they don't actually know and understand what it's like to be a dungeon master and what you have to try to deal with and what you need to do. Okay, and if they did, you'll find if you were sitting down at a table with a whole lot of other dungeon masters, they're much more accommodating for anything that you do. Okay, remember, you're making stuff on the spot, okay? You're not having a lot of time to do these things. So, and also I had just pointed out before about players improvising with their characters and not being impressive at doing that. Players may think that they're doing a great job, but you as a dungeon master know fully well that what they're doing is not necessarily giving weight or moving the story forward. Sometimes it can be good, sometimes it can be bad. And as a dungeon master, you need to allow them to do that thing, just like they need to allow you to do your thing, which is everybody needs to learn to improvise, so you need to give everybody a bit of a break. That is my advice to you with regard to improvising. There are many other techniques for improvising. These are the ones that I use the most, which is why I've presented them. It's the ones that I can say I've found more useful than other techniques. So if you have any questions or feedback, use the comments section now. And all the best with your improvising in your games. Please give it a go. And hey, till next time, keep rolling those 20s.